don't know if this is an actual saying or not, but I'd like to think that when it comes to many cartoon properties, they are only as good as the bad guys in the series. I mean, you could have the coolest looking, most heroic acting good guys, but if they have no equally awesome or evil villain to fight week after week, then there basically is no point, is there? And you could call me biased and all, but no decade of cartoons did it best when it came to villains than the 80s. I mean, give me a more despicable lot of characters than the likes of the evil renegade Cycle. Okay, fine, maybe not him. Cool name though. Anyway, sorry. Monstar, Mumra, the Ever-Living, Cobra Commander, Skeletor, and of course, the evil Decepticon leader, Megatron. Okay, I know I've been dodging this story for ages. Not because I've had nothing to say about the Decepticon leader, but because there was a whole lot to say about him. I mean, where do I start with a character like Megatron, who has so much history, so many iterations, and so many levels to his character? We're not talking about a one-dimensional cliché mustache-twirling baddie. I mean, he may have started out as one, but has since transcended into another plane of awesomeness, into, dare I say, an animated icon of the 80s and beyond. So yeah, this is a big story. But instead of going the usual route and trying to cover everything, I figured that it would be best to zero in and focus on possibly the most interesting aspect about Megatron, his backstory. I mean, you could argue that he wasn't born bad, just drawn that way. So yeah, just to manage expectations, the toys and all that, we'll get to that in a follow-up episode. But for now, I'd like to talk about his story and how Megatron got to become Megatron. So as Julie Andrews said it best, let's start at the very beginning, in the year 1983 with the MC-13 gun Robo from the toy line Microman, or to be more specific, the subline Microchange from the Japanese toy company Takara. Anyway, as you oughta know, by this point, this robot that could transform into a realistic 1-to-1 scale Walther P38 pistol was brought over to the US along with a slew of other Microman and Diaclone robots and repackaged into the Transformers toy line the following year. And MC-13 got the prestigious role of becoming the leader of the evil faction of Decepticons, Megatron. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, as far as characters go, Megatron did sorta start out as an almost typical one-dimensional bad guy, with his original tech spec profile describing him as a combination of brute strength, military cunning, ruthlessness, and terror, hell-bent on possessing all of Earth's resources and destroying all the Autobots, before returning back to his homeworld of Cybertron to complete the Decepticon conquest. So, you know, typical bad guy stuff. But even as early as this, his very first basic profile, one specific detail set him apart from other bad dudes of the day, and that according to his motto, Megatron yearns for peace. I mean, granted, peace can be defined in many ways, and his definition is to achieve it through an oppressive and cruel rule, or more precisely, tyranny. But yeah, the use of the word peace did strike me even at a young age as unusual for a villain's end goal. Anyway, as you may all well know, what probably started out in the minds of Hasbro as just another toy line, or Sunbow as just another cartoon, or Marvel as just another short-lived toy-based comic series, turned out to be, well, more than meets the eye, and one of the most successful toy franchises ever. And of course, Megatron has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of this shocking turn of events, as his origin has been thoroughly fleshed out and developed through the years. So with regards to the OG G1 Megatron, I believe the first attempt at a real origin story was told in the pages of the Transformers UK comics, and it starts millions of years before the great Autobot and Decepticon war established in the first episode of the cartoon. As the story starts out, Megatron was originally a much celebrated sports hero, or more specifically, a gladiator. And given our real-world knowledge of ancient Roman gladiators and gladiatorial games, that would connote him being a brutal and savage individual. But as far as ancient Cybertron was concerned, their gladiatorial battles were more of the ceremonial type, an entertainment event wherein Cybertronians could showcase their athletic and acrobatic abilities, as well as their proficiencies with weaponry and such, with actual combat taking a proverbial backseat. It was basically more of a show. But here's the thing. Megatron set himself apart from other gladiators because he was a brutal and savage individual who went the extra mile to make sure that his opponents had their crap kicked out of them, and he actually came this close to killing my favorite future Autobot, Sunstreaker, had it not been for the timely intervention of Iacon's chief athlete at the time, Prime. Sorry kiddies, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the concept of Orion packs existed at this point. Anyway, Megatron reveled in the violence and carnage that he caused in the gladiatorial arena, and so did the crowds of Cybertronian spectators. And Megatron knew this and used his actions as a means to drum up support from them because apparently Megatron had bigger plans that went beyond the gladiatorial ring. See, this Megatron wanted to establish a vast empire in space, with Cybertron transformed into a cosmic dreadnought, a mobile battle station. And speaking of transforming, it was Megatron and his growing group of followers who first developed the ability to transform, no doubt increasing their popularity with the masses, or at the very least, setting them apart from the rest. And when the time was right, Megatron declared war on the current ruling overlords of Cybertron under the official banner of the Decepticons, and the rest, well, as they say, is history. Now, sticking with the concept of Megatron the Gladiator with grand ambitions of conquest, later Transformers writers took a quick step back to further shape Megatron's character by giving him a reason for his ambition. In other modern iterations of Transformers, most specifically in the IDW comics that started in the early 2000s, before even taking step in the gladiatorial ring, Megatron was an idealist, an intellectual, and I bet you didn't know it, a poet. Anyway, before we go any further, I'd like you to take that idealist part and set it aside for us to tackle a little later on. So yeah, Megatron the poet. But more significant than what Megatron was though, was the circumstances wherein he existed. In this universe, Cybertron was ruled by a certain Nominus Prime who, despite his title as a Prime, ruled the planet through corruption, social segregation, and general oppression. Under this strict caste system, a Cybertronian citizen's role in life was determined by the body that he was built in, with no space for lowly citizens to make a better life for themselves, especially with the military firmly under the control of the elite to enforce their rule. Unfortunately for Megatron, despite his exceptional intelligence, he was created as a lowly miner, and that would be where he would remain had he passively accepted his lot. Now let's throw in the idea of Megatron the Miner in with Megatron the Idealist for now. Anyway, on the onset, Megatron did try to be an instrument of change through his writing, focusing on how pacifist dissent and exchange of ideas could change things for the better. Naturally, his ideas did gain traction with the general populace, which slowly but surely took the form of a growing underground movement who propagated and lived by the slogan that they were being deceived by the corrupt rulers of Cybertron, and thus the Decepticons were born. And you thought that they were the ones deceiving us. Unfortunately, this rising unrest did reach the ears of the corrupt Senate, and they were faced with their own Sound of Music moment as they asked themselves, how do you solve a problem like Megatron? While the quickest and easiest way would be to basically kill him, and to be fair, they did give that option a whirl, or more specifically, two whirl. Ultimately though, they did come to the conclusion that ending him would just make him a martyr to his cause. And so they tried isolating Megatron by relocating him to the most remote mines on the planet. And when that didn't work, they even resorted to sending specialized agents to wipe out his memories. Eventually though, after numerous failed attempts, by this point, a very frustrated Megatron inadvertently set off a mining riot when he crossed the line and killed a Senate guard in a fit of rage after said guard had killed a fellow miner who had voiced their dissent against the Senate. After the riot was pacified, Megatron was en route to a prison when he made his escape with the help of a couple of punks, a blue bot named Rumble and a red dude named Frenzy. And just like that, Megatron went off into the great wide open and proceeded to live a life of evading the law and getting over his pacifist ways as an underground gladiator. So yeah, while IDW did take the long way around, we still end up with Megatron the Gladiator, but this time with a proper explanation for his ambitions for raising an army to fight the oppressive society that he was born into. And so despite its violent nature, especially when Megatron eventually makes his move and leads the Decepticons to pretty much decimate the corrupt Senate, you still could make a case for him being a positive agent of change. That is, if you believe that the ends would justify the means. And speaking of the ends justifying the means, as far as my channel goes, the ideal end for me would be millions of views and millions of subs. But well, you gotta start somewhere, I guess. And while I could start a revolution to get my way, I figure I could just simply ask you guys for your help, right? If you've been enjoying this story or my channel in general, help me out and spread the word. Share this story with a friend and have them share it with their friends as well. Let's make my mission of telling stories about my collection, one toy at a time, grow. Onward, my toy shelf-decons. Okay, I'll stop. As always, thank you for your support. So with that out of the way, let's get to arguably the most well-rounded origin story of Megatron, which pretty much ties in all the elements of the past origins into something more cohesive and, in my opinion, more poignant, for the simple reason that it is tied in with the origin of the other side of the Megatron coin, the Autobot leader, Optimus Prime, as told in the 2024 movie Transformers 1. Now, to be fair, the joint origin of Megatron and Prime isn't a new idea, as their paths have crossed multiple times in various iterations of each other's origins. Whether it's a fresh Decepticon leader, Megatron, raiding an Energon warehouse where he gravely injures a lowly worker Orion Pax that forces the hand of Alpha Trion to rebuild him into Optimus Prime, or a police captain Orion Pax arranging for the release of an unjustly imprisoned Megatron, thus unknowingly saving him from a whirl with murderous intentions. Now, given its recency, I'm pretty sure everyone watching this video knows the story of Transformers 1. But for the benefit of those not familiar, let's give this a quick go. The story starts things off with a couple of young Cybertronian miners, Orion Pax and his best friend, his brother from another mother, D16. Yeah, given the name Megatron was coined by Marvel writer Bob Budiansky as a combination for the words Megaton and Electron, with the whole point being coming up with a scary sounding name, it just wouldn't have fit as a moniker for a pretty decent dude who was best buds with Orion. Instead, the writers went with D16, which was the number designation of the original Megatron toy in Japan, Decepticon number 16. I know it does sound rather bland, but I mean, it could have been worse. At least they didn't go with Minitron. Anyway, despite being the bestest of friends, it's established pretty early on that personality-wise, Orion and D couldn't be any more different. Pax was the dreamer, the guy who firmly believed that there was more to his existence than being just a lowly Energon miner. D16, is predictably the opposite, the idealistic miner, the one who believes in just doing a good job as a miner. Do as you're told and things will turn out right. You know the type. And all this brings to mind my favorite band of all time, the Counting Crows, and their epic song, Round Here. I know that this seems like a bit of a stretch, but go with me on this one. See, in the song, the central character is a disillusioned mess of a person who grew up being told by his elders and those he respected that round here, you always stand up straight. We all look the same, and we talk like lions. He is told that doing all this, staying in line, is how he will come to radiate, shine, and carve out a name for himself in the future. But of course, in the end, he comes to realize that all this isn't necessarily true. Life won't always work out for yourself just because you stay in your lane and do what you're told. You have to go beyond that. This is a truth that the character learns a little bit too late, and which leaves him confused, uncertain, and scared. D16 is that central character wherein he has fully subscribed to his lot in life as a miner and sees no other purpose to his life beyond it. This is what he is, and this is all he has to do. He's completely bought into the lies that their leader, the glorious Sentinel Prime, has fed him and his fellow miners, that their work, their sacrifice is the backbone of Cybertronian society, and that they endanger their lives every cycle for the ultimate glory of Cybertron. And D16 is content with that. He's proud of that. He's completely drunk on the Kool-Aid. Of course, we all know, or eventually come to know, that this is all a lie, that Sentinel Prime is the true villain looking out for himself, that the minor class are just pawns, sacrificed just like lambs in order to keep the status quo of a false world ruled by a false idol, who in truth betrayed the true leaders, the original 13 Primes, to their ancient enemies, the Quintessons, and who continues to work with the Quintessons by secretly surrendering the precious energon that is mined by D16, Orion Pax, other miners like B and Alita, just to keep him in power. And when D16 realizes this, that his world, his ideals are just one big lie, he is left destroyed. See, unlike his brother Pax, who always believed that there was something more to their lives, this life was all that D16 had. And now, just like the dude in the song, he was left with nothing but confusion, uncertainty, and fear. And you know what they say about fear? As a wise little green dude from a galaxy far, far away once said, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. Unsurprisingly, D16 embraces the anger, is completely consumed by his hate, and swiftly descends into his own darkness. And when given the choice to either save his brother Orion from certain death or kill Sentinel Prime, he chooses the latter. The final nail in the coffin is set when, due to his desire to find a less violent way to fix Cybertron, even at the cost of his own life, Orion is chosen by the ancient Cybertronian god Primus and is granted the Matrix and becomes a Prime, the central concept that D16 has come to hate. And it is too much for him to see his former friend, his brother, become the symbol, the physical representation of his ideal, shattered world, which in his eyes becomes the ultimate betrayal. In the end, D16 takes on the name Megatron after his real-life hero, Megatronus, one of the original 13 Primes that Sentinel had murdered. And he leads a significant splinter faction of Cybertronians who share his belief of being deceived by the regime of the Primes to form the Decepticons. I've said it before and I'll say it again, with all due respect to the 1986 animated movie, Transformers 1 is the greatest Transformers movie, no, story, ever told. But see, all of this, the story of how Megatron came to be, is only half the story. Regardless of how he got there, what happens to Megatron after he becomes one of the greatest villains of all time? See, that's the beauty of the Megatron character, in that while you can argue for and possibly see the choices that he made that led him down a dark path as justified, his story doesn't quite end there and actually takes quite an unexpected turn in a couple of modern iterations of the Decepticon leader. The first would be the Megatron from the 2010 cartoon series Transformers Prime, who did share a similar origin to what we covered earlier, but what is interesting about this Megatron is where he eventually ended up. After spending 3 full seasons being the main antagonist to the Autobots, as he should be, towards the end of the series, he's apparently killed off by a Star Saber-wielding Bumblebee. But that isn't the end that I'm talking about, as just like in the 86 movie, this Megatron is revived and reconstructed into a new host by and for Unicron in his bid to destroy Cybertron itself, which turns out to be his arch-enemy, Primus. And Megatron, while conscious, finds himself a prisoner in his own body, unable to stop Unicron. In the end, he is eventually freed when Unicron is defeated by Prime, and while his Decepticons expect Megatron to return as their leader, he had other plans. Apparently, having experienced being a prisoner in his own body significantly changed Megatron. After personally tasting oppression, he no longer wished to inflict it on others. Megatron declared the Decepticon movement dead, and well, peace outs. Leaves, never to be seen again. I remember this turn of events being rather jarring and abrupt, and I'm pretty sure a lot of fans of the show were turned off by it. But looking at it in the bigger picture, I think it planted the seed of the possibility of Megatron actually growing as a character, which ultimately made him more interesting and compelling. And then IDW came along and, well, completely took this idea and ran away with it, as you can say that they pretty much shattered some glass and gave us Megatron, the Autobot. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the original IDW Transformers story ran from 2005 all the way up to 2018, which I believe holds the record of being the longest continuous Transformers story told ever. And in those 13 years, I think it's pretty safe to say that they ran Megatron through the gauntlet of character phases, from the pacifist poet to the disgruntled miner, violent gladiator, revolutionary, all the way up to the tyrannical and merciless leader whom we are all familiar with. But I'm sure you've heard the saying that you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Well, that's what this Megatron came to realize. While his story started out as a hero's tale, at least in his mind, of him standing up to overturn a corrupt and oppressive system, in his quest for his idea of peace and a new way, a new order, he had basically become the embodiment of that which he originally opposed. He had become the oppressor. He was the tyrant, an individual that he could no longer continue being. And so, left with no options, Megatron did the unthinkable, willingly surrendered himself to the Autobots, and eventually became an Autobot himself. Look, I get it. This was definitely quite the controversial decision on the part of IDW that didn't sit well with everybody. I mean, I have never been a big fan of humanizing villains in general and finding ways to justify the methods to their madness. And as an unfortunate parallel, the vilification of the traditional hero to give us a more real-world and cutting-edge story. But this is different. This is Megatron coming to the conclusion and realizing just how far he has fallen and strayed from his original, arguably benevolent path. This isn't the corruption of what is good to justify Megatron's mission. This is the opposite, as Megatron himself acknowledges his own fall and failure and his desire to return to what is right. Something I can definitely get behind. In case the title of this video didn't give it away, this episode is the second part of my Megatron series. And if you missed the first part, wherein I talked about Megatron's different origin stories, I'll leave a link in the description below. So this time around, I'd like to go over the different Megatron toys that I've had in my collection over the years. G1, that is. Let's save live-action Megatron for another part. So let's get it started with the very first one, shall we? Now, back to my father. I don't know if this was his way of compensating for his time away, but the gifts that he would bring home would be some of the most awesome stuff an 80s kid could ever ask for. Star Wars, G.I. Joe, and of course, Transformers. And in one particular trip he took sometime early in 1985, he brought home for me possibly the greatest Transformers haul that I could ever dream of. Blue Streak, Megatron, and the Autobot Air Guardian Jetfire, all in one go. Granted, it was Jetfire that really made my 9-year-old head explode, but I've already done my story on the Autobot Air Guardian, which you can check out here. But in all the excitement over Jetfire, it was not lost on me that my dad had also gotten for me the much feared leader of the Decepticons, Megatron, which in itself gave me instant alpha status amongst all my friends. That being said, I'm sure that any OG Transformers fan would agree that despite his designation as the leader of the Decepticons, the original Megatron toy wasn't much to write home about. While he did transform into a pretty cool 1-to-1 scaled gun, a Walther P-38 to be exact, transforming him into his robot mode was a bit of a chore. I mean, compared to most G1 Transformers, that is. And the end result, his robot mode was just meh. With his disproportionate frame, stick-thin legs, oversized head, and well, trigger crotch. And he was a far cry from the Megatron that we saw on the TV screen. But whatever, he was still better than, say, Ironhide. That being said, at the end of the day, I believe that the original Megatron toy is probably best remembered as an awesome roleplay gun toy that we could fit out with a scope, barrel extension, shoulder stock, and naturally hold in our hands and pretend to be Starscream, blasting away all our friends. Yes, it was a different more innocent time. And speaking of the times, it was only a matter of time before the US started banning the selling of realistic-looking toy guns, meaning technically they could still be made and sold provided that they came with an orange tip or were entirely brightly colored. But Hasbro couldn't be bothered by modifying just the tip. And so when the second incarnation of Transformers rolled along in the 90s, Generation 2, I guess you could say that Megatron got an upgrade. No longer a silver robot that transformed into an equally silvery gun, the Decepticon leader now converted into a large and formidable tank that was bright green and purple. Hey, it was the 90s when tacky bright colors were a thing. But before we go any further, I'd like to make a quick commentary on this. The change that some may deem controversial. So, whose side are you on? Gun Megatron or Tank Megatron? I mean, first of all, I do understand all the G1 purists out there who do prefer the OG Megatron alt mode. And if you would ask me, I would probably prefer that as well. But even at a very young age, I did find it quite strange and, well, underwhelming that the big bad of the cartoon show, the most powerful and fearsome of the Decepticons, would basically transform and shrink into a little gun for his traitorous number 2, Starscream, to wield. I mean, yes, there was Shockwave who also transformed into a gun, but he was usually portrayed as a gigantic alien space cannon that could fly. While the cartoon writers did make sure we knew that despite its small size, Megatron's gun mode still did pack a powerful blast, the mere fact that it couldn't function on its own felt pretty silly and, well, sad. And so yeah, despite the nostalgic pull, ultimately, if you ask me, it did make more sense for Megatron to transform into a tank. That being said, my second ever Megatron toy would still be a gun. Well, sort of. After the original Megatron toy that I got in the 80s, I had to actually wait around 2 decades later, 20 years to get my next official Megatron toy. And before anyone brings it up, yes, I am skipping the whole Beast Wars Megatron. I wasn't collecting toys back then and, well, completely different character. So in 2006, we got Megatron in what was originally a filler line of Transformers called Classics. And while this Megatron was technically still a gun, he was a very stylized one based on another existing Hasbro toy, the Nerf N-Strike Maverick Blaster. How's that for some cross-brand synergy? And just to make sure Hasbro didn't get into any trouble with the toy regulators, this Megatron, while predominantly white, also had a healthy dose of bright green and purple, apparently an homage to the G2 Tank Megatron, and a bright orange tip on both his barrel and scope. And despite this much kiddier looking alt mode, as a toy, this Megs was pretty good. This was a definite upgrade and worthy update of the OG toy, despite having a ton of back kibble, which basically formed the outer shell of the alt mode. This Megs had a much more proportionate frame and pretty decent articulation, and he looked good standing next to his updated arch nemesis, Classics Optimus Prime. It's worth noting though that in Japan, where toy gun laws aren't as strict, this Megatron was released in their version of Classics called Henkei Henkei, or Transform Transform, in his more traditional silver, black, and red colors. My next Megatron toy would be another odd one in the alternative version. Now this very stylized Megatron was neither tank or gun, but instead a car. So this time around, Megatron transformed into an officially licensed Nissan 370Z. And while nice as far as cars go, I did find it a bit underwhelming for the Decepticon leader. Fortunately, Alternative Megatron's robot mode more than made up for it, trading in his signature fusion cannon for a pair of tesseractal swords, as well as gravital blades that could be flipped out from each forearm. Anyway, as odd as a car Megatron sounds, it's worth noting that this wouldn't be the only car Megatron that I would get in my collection, as years later I would buy this little dude, which I came across during a trip to Japan. And coming with his 2 Wave E lieutenants made this special 3-pack pretty impossible to resist. And speaking of little dudes, this wouldn't be the only little Megs in my collection, as back in 2011, I got this guy, a legend-sized Megatron who may not look like much, but I believe holds the distinction of being the last modern Megatron, for now, produced by Hasbro to transform into a gun. Yes, despite having the required orange tip, I do believe that the legend scaled size was the main reason why this toy was allowed to be made. And after this guy, it was pretty much all tanks for Megatron. While I never got these next two Megatrons, I do think they're both worth mentioning as well for different reasons. The first, released in 2006 as part of a deluxe Optimus Prime vs. Megatron, The Ultimate Battle 2-pack, was I believe the first modern tank Megatron toy. And then the second, also released the same year, was the die-cast Nightmare Titanium Megatron, which I almost got, but thankfully didn't, as this guy has been called by many as one of the worst Transformers ever made. I mean, the whole Transformers Titanium line was pretty bad, but this guy was the baddest of them all, and not in a good way. And speaking of good ways, do you know what would be a great way to help me and my channel out? By being a friend of the Toyshelf. If you want to enjoy early access to my main content, really early access to exclusive ones, and input as to what I could possibly tackle next in this channel, why not give my special channel membership a shot? All you gotta do is click on that join button in the homepage of my channel. And if it ultimately isn't your jam, then you can just cancel. No harm, no foul. But either way, I am extremely thankful for all your support. So, back to tanks. For me, the first official tank Megatron I would get would be Generation's War for Cybertron Megatron in 2010, which while being a Cybertronian hover tank, was still technically a tank, so it counts in my book. But before we go over more tanks, let's take a quick little detour into the first live-action movie, which came out in 2007. Now, movie Megatron is a whole different animal in my opinion, and is worthy of his own little deep dive. We'll do that for part 3. But what I would like to mention was that in the first movie, Megatron transformed into some sort of alien spaceship, which I believe was the first time Megatron was depicted as such. A flying thing, I mean. And which would most likely have served as the inspiration for the next two Megatron toys that I would get, that being animated Leader Class Megatron in 2008 and Transformers Prime Voyager Class Megatron in 2012. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, despite its rather divisive art style, I am a huge fan of Transformers Animated, both the show and the toy line, so it shouldn't be a surprise that animated Megatron is one of my favorite Megatron toys on my toy shelf, for a few reasons. First off, he is a Leader Class toy that was released during a time when Leader Class was more in reference to the actual size of the toy, so this dude is pretty massive. Secondly, despite having a few modern and aesthetic flourishes, animated Megatron looks pretty close to G1 Megatron. And finally, his ult mode, which is a very unique, massive dual-rotor assault helicopter, which kind of gives me some Cobra Mamba vibes. Plus, in robot mode, aside from his signature fusion cannon, this Megatron's rotors convert into twin blades as well. And he also talks via a voice chip that is activated when you press his Decepticon insignia on his chest. It's not a feature I really care for, but it's there. Transformers Prime Megatron is closer to the live-action movie counterpart, in that he also transformed into some sort of alien-looking spaceship. Not the best, but the fearsome bot mode does make up for it. Also, while I never got it, Hasbro did release a cool-looking retool of this toy for the Beast Hunters subline a year later, making this Megs look like a mutated flying Sharkticon. But we're getting a little bit crazy, so let's reel it back into more traditional Megatron territory for my Transformers Chug collection. From 2012 to 2016, Hasbro released quite a number of tank Megatrons in all shapes and sizes, all of which I passed on. But just for the sake of mentioning, we got this really odd homage to G2 Megatron in 2012, which was basically a retool of a movie toy bludgeon. Weird, but strangely, quite cool looking. But ultimately, a pass. The thrilling 30 line in 2013 gave us a couple more Megatrons, both based on his two distinct looks from the IDW comics. First was the Legends class Minor Megatron with his even smaller sidekick Chop Shop, And the second was the sleek deluxe-sized Uni-Wing bomber version, which I might have gotten if it was released at a larger scale. So, both passes. Hasbro did try to fix things by giving us a leader class size Megatron as part of their Combiner Wars line in 2015. But for me, it was just too big. So yeah, another pass. I know, I can be pretty hard to please. But anyway, the following year, they finally gave us an appropriately sized Voyager Megs. Unfortunately, this guy was part of the Titans Returns line, wherein everybody was a headmaster. And this guy was obviously meant to be a pre-tool for Blitzwing, so I didn't fall for that one, Hasbro. Pass. Finally though, in 2019, Hasbro got it right. Sort of, with their War for Cybertron Siege Megatron. Appropriate Voyager size, well-proportioned bot mode, pretty fearsome head sculpt, and finally, a cool, albeit Cybertronian, tank mode. Check, 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 check. The only issue I had with this guy was that his paint job was pretty lackluster or non-existent, and that whole grungy and grimy look of the Siege line, yeah, I could do without it. Despite its faults though, this was a pretty solid version of Megatron, and Hasbro knew it as they re-released this toy in many different repainted and retooled versions. I myself settled for the premium painted Netflix release and have been quite happy with it. Hasbro did give us an Earth version retool, but for me it was weighed, measured, and found wanting. I don't know, I just couldn't get behind that very wonky head sculpt. So for now, Siege Megatron remains my default Chug Decepticon leader. That is, until the much highly anticipated Studio Series 86 version is finally released. Oh, and I do think it's worth mentioning that for all the OG purists out there, a third-party company called New Age has your back, with a Chug-ish option of a G1 Megatron that transforms into a gun. I know it sounds awesome, and I have heard awesome things about their Romulus, but for me, granted both bot and alt modes look pretty great, the engineering is much too complex for a Chug toy. But the biggest negative against this guy is that he is dwarfed by the Studio Series 86 Prime. I mean, to be fair, given the developmental time of these toys, Romulus was most likely designed before Studio Series 86 Prime was a thing, and was intended to pair up with its immediate predecessor, Earthrise Prime, which it does, quite nicely. And now that we're into third party, how about we segue to Masterpiece Megatron territory, wherein between the years 2015 to 16, a war was waged by 3 third-party companies for the ultimate Masterpiece Megatron toy. But before we go into that, we do have to mention that way back in 2007, the first official Masterpiece Megatron was released by Takara, and it was bad. Really bad. Possibly one of the worst official Masterpiece toys released ever. I mean, if your Masterpiece can barely stand on its own and let alone hold up its own fusion cannon, you know you've got a clunker. Keep in mind that at the time of its release, the whole Masterpiece Transformers scene was still in its infancy, and so any Masterpiece release was a big event, and I naturally got caught up in the hype, which I almost immediately regretted the moment I pulled MP05 out of the box. I mean, the guy was horribly engineered. Like, I must have transformed him once from robot to pistol, which, while nice, is oversized, and back to robot. And that was it. I never transformed him again. And for someone who loves transforming Transformers, that is a huge thing. Anyway, needless to say, as far as Masterpiece Megatrons go, MP05 was definitely not it for me, and for a lot of collectors as well. Fast forward 8 years later, and Masterpiece Transformers is now a cohesive, robust, and popular line for older collectors. And with multiple third-party companies now in the game, the need for a proper Masterpiece Megatron was at an all-time high. And as I mentioned earlier, we had 3 viable options on the table. Apollyon by X-Transbots, Mitron by DX9, and Despotron by Make Toys. Of the 3, I believe Apollyon was the most popular, but while he did look the part, from what I heard, his engineering was also a bit of a nightmare, and given my trauma from handling MP05, he was a pass for me. Despotron by Make Toys looked to have the best and most unique design and engineering, but his bot mode looked a bit too stylized and, well, chonky. Ultimately, I ended up getting Mitron from DX9, who won me over with the slick and ingenious way his arms and legs neatly compressed for gun mode, and his excellent face sculpt that looked like Megatron straight out of the cartoon. But just when I thought my search for the perfect masterpiece Megatron was done, Takara came roaring back a couple years later with a Megatron to blow away all third-party Megatrons. Released in 2018, MP36 definitely had a more ingenious and intuitive design than both Apollyon and Despotron, and he looked even more tune-accurate than Mitron. If you've handled all these other masterpiece Megatrons, I'm sure you'd agree that there is just a more noticeable smoothness and sleekness to MP34's engineering and design, and it's not even close. It really was a no-brainer and an insta-buy. I do still have my Mitron though, as I think he pairs up quite nicely with my MP10 Prime. But as far as masterpiece Megatrons are concerned, in my opinion, Takara still holds the crown. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out that this is the third part of my mini-series about the Decepticon leader Megatron. If you haven't seen the first part, wherein I cover Megatron's different origin stories, or part 2, where I talk about the different Megatron toys, I've got the links of both of them in the description below, so please do check them out. Take note though that both parts are all about G1 Megatron, not the live-action one, which is what I will cover in this episode. So with that out of the way, let's go back in time to the year 2004. The year when Transformers fans all around the world went absolutely nuts with the official announcement of the very first ever live-action Transformers movie being officially greenlit. And from that point on, all the way up to its actual release in 2007, the interwebs were afire with news and speculation as to how the movie would eventually end up. Every bit of information, interview quotes, official or leaked concept art, and production pictures were thoroughly discussed and analyzed by Transformers fans everywhere. Of course, I would think that the two greatest concerns of the fandom were basically which Transformers would actually be in the movie and what they would look like. I mean, there were the two obvious ones, the iconic leaders of the Autobot and Decepticon factions, Optimus Prime and Megatron, who had very distinct looks. Granted, we all had to collectively accept the jarring general aesthetic shift from smooth, blocky robots into sharp and at times convoluted alienish beings. For the most part, at least when it came to the Autobot leader, Prime's general look did pay a reasonable enough homage to the OG design. A bit bluer and flamier than usual, but still recognizable as Prime. Megatron, on the other hand, was another story. So we have this really early concept dated 2005, which was probably during a point where they were still experimenting on the overall look and still leaning towards the cartoons for inspiration. While nothing spectacular, there was no mistaking this as none other than Megatron. But a year later, this little picture surfaced of a huge spiky thing that, due to its predominantly gray color, was heavily theorized to be Megatron. And we didn't have to wait very long, a few months actually, to find our theories confirmed, with even more clearer concept art released. Yeah, let's just say not everybody was thrilled about this. The actual timeline is a bit fuzzy, but I do believe that by this time, we had seen a good number of concepts released. Some pretty cool, like this unfamiliar character Blackout, and some like Starscream looking like a cross between a gorilla and a Dorito. But either way, for better or for worse, we had already accepted the fact that we would not be getting the same bots that we grew up watching on TV. That being said, Megatron was a much harder pill to swallow. Yes, he looked pretty fearsome and he was gray, and that's about all that he had in common with the Megatron that we knew. I mean, twisted metallic spiky details aside, there was nothing that gave off any Transformers, hell, robotic vibes. This design looked almost organic. And yet, all of this could have been saved had the designers included just one iconic detail that would have easily identified him as Megatron: his enormous fusion cannon that he wielded on his right arm. But yeah, even that wasn't there. Anyway, the first Transformers movie finally arrived, and well, despite all our fears and worries, it was quite the epic event. It was far from perfect, of course, but I think it's safe to say that for the most part, a decisive majority of Transformers fans, including myself, loved it. For all its faults, the first Transformers live-action movie was a major financial success, and more importantly, turned those robots in disguise into household names. And as for Megatron, he didn't do too bad for himself as well, even if he was pretty much barely in the movie, but that was okay. Now I know that if you're watching this video, you've most likely seen the 2007 movie, but again, for the sake of those who haven't, the movie tells the story of an alien race from the planet Cybertron who come to Earth in search for the movie MacGuffin called the Allspark, an ancient artifact that is the source of life for all Cybertronians. Anyway, while not told in the movie per se, this Megatron's backstory was told in the pages of the supplementary comics by IDW. As that story goes, millions of years ago, Megatron was brothers in arms with Optimus Prime, both serving under the leadership of Sentinel Prime. Unfortunately, this arrangement ultimately didn't sit well with Megatron, as it became obvious over time that Sentinel favored Optimus and viewed him as his eventual successor. Gee, I would think that the shared name Prime would tip him off. In the end, Megatron came to resent Prime, which led him into forming the Decepticons and waging war on the Primes. Anyway, amidst this great war, Optimus Prime felt it best to blast the Allspark into space to keep it away from Megatron. But Megatron gives chase to the Allspark on his own and ends up being lost in space as well, which leads us right into the first live-action movie set in the present day. Well, 2007. So it turns out that the Allspark crashed onto the planet Earth, and Megatron, literally hot on its trail, lands in the North Pole where his body, extremely heated up from planet entry, melts the ice beneath his feet, submerging the Decepticon in freezing waters below, placing him offline. Anyway, millions of years later, both the Allspark and the frozen Megatron are eventually discovered and recovered by the American government agency Sector 7, which is where they remain for the majority of the movie. Of course, aside from hunting down the Allspark, the Decepticons arrive on Earth in order to find their lost leader as well, which they eventually do. In the final act of the movie, a frozen Megatron is thawed out, revived, and begins to wreak havoc on the humans and Autobots alike. And just to give credit where credit is due, I do believe that the writers did a good job in building up the threat of Megatron throughout the movie. And when he finally did arrive, he did not disappoint. Within his first few minutes of action, he manages to berate Starscream, classic Megatron, rip the fan-favorite Autobot Jazz in half, instantly killing him, and shoots down Prime with his fusion cannon? Okay, so I could be wrong, but I do believe that this Megatron's version of a fusion cannon was sort of a last-minute addition to appease the fans. I don't know. It just felt forced and looked pretty lame. With him clapping both hands together to form a cannon out of nowhere, you'd think he set off a sonic boom or something. But in any case, the point was that this Megatron, voiced by the actor Hugo Weaving, really felt like a true menace, a transformer that all other Transformers feared. A boogeyman type of character whose revival and return genuinely terrified the Autobots. Until, that is, he met his embarrassing end at the hands of the human Sam Witwicky, who overloads Megatron with the power of the Allspark. Yeah, that kinda sucked. And what sucked even more was that Megatron's fate was spoiled for me as I was in line to enter the theater, as some a-hole who was on his second watch just blurted it out in front of everyone. Fucker. Anyway, despite being dead and dropped into the deepest underwater trench on Earth at the end of the first movie, it wasn't a big surprise to see Megatron revived at the beginning of the second movie, The Revenge of the Fallen. But honestly, if you ask me, I think it would have been better off that he stayed dead. Almost immediately after his resurrection, the writers pretty much castrate his character by making him subservient to the new baddie of the film, the Fallen. I don't know, it was such an abrupt switch, with one scene where he claims while choking Starscream that there is no command but his, to the very next one where he literally bows down to his master. It pretty much ruined his character. Now, to be fair, he did manage to kill Optimus Prime during an epic forest fight in the middle of the movie, but when Prime was eventually resurrected, Megatron was basically no match and was easily defeated. And in the end, basically ran away with his proverbial tail between his legs to fight another day. And just like his master's namesake, this Megatron had fallen far from the frightening dude that we were introduced to in the first movie and into the decrepit and literally rotting loser we find in the next movie, Dark of the Moon. The third live-action movie finds Megatron living a sad life of isolation in the middle of the African plains of Namibia, sitting on a ramshackle throne of junk being kept company by a skeleton crew of Decepticon operatives, namely Starscream, Soundwave, Laserbeak, and some little dude named Igor. Anyway, when the new baddie of the movie was revealed to be the recently revived, spoiler, Sentinel Prime, Megatron joins forces with the old ex-Autobot in his grand plan to activate a space bridge to bring Cybertron to Earth. In the end, in true bad guy fashion, Megatron betrayed Sentinel Prime as he was this close to killing Optimus Prime, basically saving him. And in gratitude, Prime, well, jams his battle axe into Megatron's head and rips it from his body, spine included, and pretty much ends him. Until Megatron is rebuilt and reborn for the fourth movie as dun 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 Galvatron. But the less said about this transformium-fueled transformer, the better. Just kidding. I've got a whole episode on Galvatron next week, so stay tuned for that one. And finally, we have the last version of the live-action movie Megatron in The Last Night, wherein Megatron, that's right, Megatron, because apparently somewhere between the fourth and fifth movie, Galvatron hooked up with a new master, the Cybertronian goddess Quintessa, who, aside from restoring him back to Megatron with a new knightly body, tasks him with retrieving her stolen staff, which she needs to drain the life force of Earth in order to restore the ruined Cybertron. At first glance, aside from the fact that he submits once again to do the bidding of another master, this seems like a return to form for Megs. I mean, he definitely looks a lot better and cooler until you realize that character-wise, he's pretty much become a caricature of his former self. I mean, Megatron from the first movie annoyingly flicked away humans as they ran away from him. And now here he was comically negotiating with them to release more of his Decepticons who were in custody. Really? The OG movie Megs would have just taken his men by force. Who knows? Maybe the humans were holding his beloved Igor hostage or something. In any case, he does assemble his crew, who are introduced in an out-of-nowhere montage ripped straight out of the Suicide Squad movie. Mohawk, Dreadbot, Nitro Zeus, Onslaught. I mean, you'd think that given such an intro that these guys would go down as some of the biggest and baddest Decepticons ever. But no, they're basically just mostly killed off in the next action scene by the Autobots led by Grimlock. And Megatron? Well, he fails once again and gets his ass whooped by Prime. Like, he's literally kicked in the chest through a wall and is never seen again. Nothing memorable at all. And that was it. One last thing worth mentioning about this guy was that the voice of the original G1 Megatron, the legendary Frank Welker, returned to give life to this version of Megs. Actually, he also voiced Galvatron in the previous movie as well. So, yeah, looking at this version of Megatron's full character arc, there really isn't much to see but the progressive destruction of what should be one of the most iconic Transformers of all time. After what I consider to be a pretty strong, fairly adequate debut, it was pretty much downhill from there, and will most likely be recognized in history as one of the worst portrayals of Megatron's character ever. But it's not all bad. In fact, I would say that this Megatron has at least one significant redeeming factor, and that would be his ever-evolving designs, and, well, as a result, his toys. To a certain degree, that is. And unlike his character arc, which got progressively worse from movie to movie, I would argue that his designs actually got significantly better with every new movie. So with that being said, let's go over them, shall we? But not before I go over my obligatory plea for you to help me make my channel grow and help me make more stories. You know the drill. Comment, like, subscribe, and share. All easily done with a single click. Except the first one, that is. You gotta type that one out. Regardless, though, of whichever way you choose to help me out, I will forever be grateful for the support. So, thank you. And now back to our story. First up, 2007 movie Megatron. Clearly, this is the weakest live-action Megatron in terms of appearance, as what we saw in the concept art was pretty much what we got on screen. Seeing this Megs come to life on the movie screen only made him look slightly better in my opinion. Bot mode was still blah, evoking nothing that I would call a transformer, but to be fair, he did transform into a three-pronged alien jet with bat-like wings ending in wingtips that pointed straight down. I mean, it wasn't terrible, just weird. And Hasbro designers definitely had their work cut out for them translating this design into plastic form. I mean, given the limitations at the time, I believe that the leader class Megatron that we got was just okay. He was big, as was par for the course for leader class toys at the time. But as was also the case, he was chock full of gimmicks like a sound chip, auto-morphing, and additional pop-up translucent spiky thingies. Oh, and he was also a little bit more colorful than the Megatron that we saw in the movie, with a few more bluish hues and the aforementioned pop-up spikes that were translucent pink. I'm guessing that the designers threw in all these gimmicks in order to distract us from the fact that this Megatron was far from accurate to what we saw in the movie, as they weren't able to completely hide away the majority of his alt mode wings in robot mode. Honestly though, I thought that his partially exposed wings made him look more imposing, but what do I know? The real fail for this guy was his alien ship alt mode, which looked extremely forced. A mess really, that is best left at that. Revenge of the Fallen saw Megatron ditch his alien jet mode and replace it with an alien tank, which apparently still had the ability to fly, so good for him. But for me, what mattered more was his robot mode, which was definitely more bulky and imposing, except for his left arm, which was more skeletal and scrawny in appearance. Reminding me of that SNL character played by Kristen Wiig, I forget her name, who had really tiny hands. But overall, I didn't mind the asymmetrical look as I felt it gave Megatron a little more personality, and of course, put more emphasis on his right arm, which was super jacked up, and finally wielded a formidable fusion cannon / bladed weapon. And Megatron's alien dual-toed feet from the first movie were also replaced by a pair of really oversized tank treads, which I imagine made walking a whole lot easier. But more importantly, I think it made him look cool and more menacing. The leader class toy that was released wasn't that bad either. Still not completely screen accurate, but good enough in my opinion. And for the longest time served the role as the default Megatron for my Transformers movie collection. By the third movie, Megatron finally settled down with a more earthy-looking alt mode, now transforming into a massive, imposing, but still spiky fuel truck. And despite looking a lot more disheveled, I would argue that this Megatron was even more polished than his predecessor, replacing that previous monstrous hunchback frame with one that was more humanoid. I mean, the guy even sported some clothes in the form of a ratty old tarp that covered his fuel container in truck mode, and formed a cloak / poncho in robot mode, complete with a hood that kinda concealed his half-blown-off head, which was infested by little robot repair drones. Or whatever, robot bugs. I have to confess though that by this time I had pretty much lost interest in Transformers movie toys, and so never got a toy version of this Megatron, as well as the next version of Galvatron from the fourth movie, which saw him converting into a much more modern and sleeker truck cab, but whose toy was basically a glorified shell former. Easy pass. And finally, while arguably the worst version of Megatron in terms of character, I believe that the fifth movie, The Last Knight, gave us the best looking Megatron design of them all. I mean, yes, you could argue that he still kinda didn't look anything like what Megatron should look like, but for what it was, I thought he looked pretty cool, with his overall darker hue evoking the trope of a villainous Black Knight wearing an ominous-looking battle mask with a glaring red streak across one side, which could open up to reveal a menacing sharp-toothed demonic face. To be honest, his tusked head design did look strangely similar to a certain artificial intelligence turned evil robot hell-bent on wiping out mankind introduced a couple years earlier in a film about avenging. But that's beside the point. This Megs also came with his signature fusion cannon, which admittedly looked a little smaller than usual, but he made up for it with his more knightly weaponry and equipment comprised of an imposing shield and a huge long sword, which was modeled after the African Konda sword or Ikakalaka. I guess Megs picked up more than we thought, blessing the rains down in Africa. And as for his alt mode, he was also back to transforming into an alien-looking spaceship, but this time around, it was a sleeker, more cohesive-looking aircraft. But before we go any further, I think it's worth mentioning that by this time, Hasbro did step up its movie Transformers toy game by basically rebooting everything with a new and more accurate studio series line where we got much more improved, albeit smaller versions of all the different Megatrons from the first 3 movies. I'm not sure if they did a last night one though. Please let me know in the comments below. But ultimately, as nice as all these Megatrons were, I honestly didn't care because by this time I had completely sold off all my retail Transformer movie toys and had since moved on to the larger, more accurate movie masterpiece toys, with a collection of mostly knocked off but arguably improved Hasbro releases and third-party ones as well. And while I originally set off to just complete the 2007 movie lineup, topped off with a very much improved movie masterpiece Megatron from the first movie, okay, fine, you got me. This is the knockoff and way better version of that release. Anyway, in 2020, third-party company Unique Toys caused me to seriously reconsider my hard line on that plan when they gave us their version of the Last Night Megatron called Dragoon. Now I know I say this a lot, but this was definitely an engineering accomplishment as Dragoon was a highly detailed and articulated, kibble-free robot that transformed into a streamlined jet with 0 visible robot parts. I mean, seriously, I am not exaggerating when I say that at first glance, you wouldn't think that this robot actually transformed into a jet, and vice versa, that the jet was actually capable of transforming into a robot. It's that good. And of course, to accomplish this toy sorcery, you would think that it would entail some extremely headache-inducing transformation, but surprisingly, it doesn't. I mean, I won't go flipping this guy between modes all the time, but for what it is, it's far from a nightmare transformation. Anyway, despite all these praises, I did not end up getting Dragoon, but instead opted for the 4th-party version. That's right, a knockoff version of this third-party bot. Released a year later, it was an impulse buy really, something to soothe the sting of seeing my beloved Lakers, the defending 2020 NBA champs, lose their bid to repeat and unfortunately go down to the Phoenix Suns in 6 games. I mean, they should have easily won that series and possibly the championship had Anthony Davis not gotten injured in Game 4, but sorry, I'm going off tangent here. So yeah, I opted for the knockoff version of Dragoon for 2 main reasons. First, that it was slightly improved from the original one in terms of quality and deco, but more importantly, he was bigger. So yeah, a real no-brainer for me. And while usually after the initial dopamine rush of getting a new toy eventually fades, I am left with an empty pit of regret over such an unplanned purchase, this guy has remained one of my favorites in my collection to this day. In fact, it led me to get more members of his crew to keep him company. I think it's pretty safe to say that when it comes to life, one truth we can all accept is that change is inevitable, especially when it comes to a toy line that is best known for transforming. After finishing off a second successful year of Transformers toys, Hasbro felt that for the 3rd year, a big change was due. And that change came in the form of discontinuing most of the characters introduced in the first year of the line in order to make room for a whole lot more toys for us to buy. And so, looking at the new 1986 Transformers catalog, while there most likely was that one kid or two who noticed the non-presence of Huffer or Skywarp, I'm pretty sure everybody noticed the absence of 2 more prominent characters, the Autobot and Decepticon leaders, Optimus Prime and Megatron. And in their place, a couple of City Commanders, Ultra Magnus for the Autobots, and Galvatron for the Decepticons. Now, Magnus I was pretty familiar with as his toy was originally released in the Japanese Diaclone line with different colors. But Galvatron, now he was new, and to be honest, as far as first impressions went, I was far from impressed, and it never crossed my 10-year-old brain that this guy was supposed to be the new Decepticon leader. See, at this point, despite their absence in the new catalog, I don't think any kid thought Hasbro was crazy enough to get rid of arguably the two most popular and recognizable Transformers, and that when the much anticipated full-length movie rolled around, they would both be front and center leading their respective sides into battle. Well, we all know what happened. Prime and Megs were there, and they had their epic fight. And then they were gone. Prime had his emotional but traumatic deathbed scene that sent kids off crying, pissing off parents, and apparently saving a certain real American hero's life. And Megatron? Well, he got an upgrade. After his fight with Prime, a really effed up Megatron is dumped out into space by Starscream, where he drifts off aimlessly around until he is found by the new major baddie of the movie, the Chaos Bringer and Planet Eater, Unicron, who upgrades Megatron into a new, more powerful form, Galvatron. And for this upgrade, Galvatron is given the mission to hunt down and destroy Unicron's one weakness, the Autobot Matrix of Leadership. And after a quick detour to render Starscream into ashes, Galvatron accomplishes his mission and takes the Matrix, but instead attempts to use it to enslave his own master. And for his troubles, Unicron simply swallows the dude, Matrix and all. And it's inside Unicron where Galvatron meets his new Autobot leader counterpart, Rodimus Prime, who makes quick work of Galvatron by hurling him out into space and defeats Unicron by unleashing the full power of the Matrix inside him. And that, in a nutshell, was our introduction to the new leader of the Decepticons, Galvatron. Anyway, post-movie, Galvatron continued to lead the Decepticons in the third season of the cartoon, with a twist. See, in the movie, Galvatron, voiced by the iconic Leonard Nimoy, was portrayed as a cold, calculating, and brutal individual. Ruthless, but composed with a clear sense of strategy and purpose. As reflective of his new head design that looked like a king's crown, Galvatron had a certain regal arrogance to him, fitting for a newly empowered leader. But in the post-movie cartoon, Galvatron, now voiced by the OG Megatron voice actor Frank Welker, was portrayed as wildly erratic and completely insane, prone to violent outbursts, paranoia, and irrational plans. But there are reasons for this. See, at the end of the movie, after getting thrown out into space by Rodimus, Galvatron ends up crashing into the planet Thrall, or to be more specific, a plasma lava pit on the planet Thrall, and he remained trapped there until he was recovered by his loyal soldiers Cyclonus and Scourge. And while he survived, he basically had all the logical Nimoys wiped out from his brain, leaving one hell of a messed up dude. I mean, if you were trapped in a lava pit for an extended period of time and actually managed to survive, wouldn't that majorly F you up too? Anyway, I mentioned this because it's this specific character trait that pretty much defines who Galvatron is in almost every other iteration of the new Decepticon leader. Unlike Megatron, who was usually driven by a glorious, albeit misguided purpose, Galvatron was basically batshit crazy, and this is illustrated best in the cartoon episode Web World, wherein his most trusted lieutenant, Cyclonus, tricks Galvatron into going into therapy. As the story goes, Galvatron is committed, against his will, to the planet Torkulon, a sort of medical asylum. And after several unsuccessful attempts to cure him, the Torkulon therapists decide it's best to just basically wipe his mind clean by linking him up with the planet itself, which turns out to be some sort of supercomputer. But this ultimately turns out to be a bad idea, as Galvatron's madness ends up infecting, overwhelming, and defeating the planet itself. So yeah, the dude is that crazy. But as entertaining as Matt Galvatron was in the cartoons, I believe that Galvatron's true potential was fully realized and displayed in the comics. Most notably in the UK comics, wherein writer Simon Furman mixed in the new element of time travel to Galvatron's story from the 1986 movie. So apparently, after being created by Unicron, the ever-calculating Galvatron formulates a plan to free himself from his master's control, harnessing a time jump mechanism that is most likely powered by
1.21 gigawatts!
Galvatron, along with Scourge and Cyclonus, travel back in time from the year 2006 to 1986, with the grand plan of building a massive space cannon and burying it unnoticed underneath the spot where the Autobots would one day construct Autobot City. The cannon is set to go off in 20 years, blasting up through the Autobot City and striking Unicron at a predetermined location, destroying the Planet Eater and the Autobots in one fell swoop. Talk about playing the long game. In the end, though, Galvatron and company are defeated by the joint Autobot and Decepticon forces, including Autobots from the future, Cup, Blur, and Hot Rod, who had apparently been sent back in time by Unicron to stop Galvatron. Anyway, after this, Galvatron and time travel became a thing, with the future Decepticon leader repeatedly traveling through the time streams, being a thorn in both the present-day Autobot and Decepticon sides, and even at times teaming up with his past self, Megatron. Or was that a clone? Whatever. In any case, all this constant traveling finally caused a rift in the time stream, leading to a catastrophic time storm that ultimately destroys Galvatron. But not to be upstaged by the UK comics, the US Transformers comics had their own unique take on Galvatron. This time, a Decepticon from an alternate future timeline wherein he ruled a post-apocalyptic Earth, where the Decepticons had conquered the Americas. As was the norm, this Galvatron had descended into madness as well, displaying delusional behavior and talking to the corpse of Rodimus Prime, which he kept on display as a trophy. Anyway, this dude is unfortunately snatched up by the main continuity Unicron to be his herald and lead his attack against Cybertron. Naturally, this Galvatron is not happy with once again being forced into servitude, but instead of openly defying Unicron, decides to go the sneakier route and try and undermine him from within. So Galvatron secretly ventures to the core of Cybertron and successfully persuades the Transformer god Primus to unite all Transformers to resist Unicron. And when Unicron attacks, Galvatron, powered up by Cybertron's energy, takes on the Chaos Bringer by himself and gets casually swatted away. But despite his defeat, his symbolic gesture manages to rally the Transformers to unite, turning the tide of the battle. So, good job, Galvatron. In the end, though, this Galvatron is defeated by the Autobot Fortress Maximus in a pretty savage fight. I mean, Galvatron was literally biting wires off Fort Max's shoulder, but is ultimately punched into a frozen lake where he sinks, never to be seen again. And that was that. At least for Marvel's take. Because apparently, years later, comic company IDW would come along and give yet another unique version of Galvatron. So unique that he was no longer an upgraded Megatron or the unwilling servant of Unicron, but his own character, separate from the OG Decepticon leader and servant of someone else. But we'll get to that a little later on. In the IDW universe, Galvatron is a brutal and ambitious Cybertronian warrior from the ancient past, long before the Autobot Decepticon War. So, millions of years ago, Galvatron, alongside his twin brother RC, yes, that RC. I'll place a link to that story in the description below. So, millions of years ago, Galvatron and RC were a couple of slave gladiators who served under various warring primes. Eventually, he comes into the service of Nova Prime and joins him on his mission to expand Cybertronian civilization across the galaxy. Galvatron is part of Nova Prime's ill-fated crew that sets off for a far-off region in space called the Benzuli Expanse, where they are pulled into a corrupt parallel dimension ominously called the Dead Universe, wherein they remain trapped for a very, very, very long time. In the Dead universe, Nova Prime is corrupted further into Nemesis Prime, and Galvatron is transformed into his undead herald. Well, to be fair, the entire crew, which included Cyclonus, Scourge, this mad scientist dude named Jyaxus, another dude named Tailpipe, and is that Grimlock? Anyway, the whole crew were all corrupted into living dead, or sort of immortal beings that could apparently only survive for a limited time outside the Dead universe. So naturally, they make their move in the present day with a new mission of merging the dead and living universes together. Unsurprisingly, Galvatron eventually betrays Nova Prime, and he himself is defeated by Prime, who hurls him into a solar pool. Of course, being sort of immortal, Galvatron returns once again, this time powered by a fragment of the Dead universe's energy, a sort of anti-matrix that he dubs the Heart of Darkness, and given purpose with a new mission to defeat a mysterious dark entity that he encountered in the Dead universe called the Void. Not the Void, the Void. An unbelievably powerful mass of eyes and black tentacles turned huge convoluted demonic beast thing that seeks to devour the life of entire worlds in order to satiate its hunger. Fortunately though, it is unable to leave the Dead universe without outside help, which he hopes to get from Galvatron, who races off with the Heart of Darkness to Cybertron in order to rally an army of Autobots and Decepticons to fight the emerging threat of the Void. But apparently, this is what the Void wanted, as the Heart of Darkness that Galvatron wielded was in fact an extension of the Void, and him bringing it to Cybertron, essentially a dead planet itself, would cause it to transform it into an immense portal for the Void to emerge from. Sneaky, sneaky. And in the climactic battle, despite creating a Deceptigod out of a merged and mind-controlled Decepticon army, the Void is finally defeated by, surprise, surprise, Optimus Prime and the Matrix of Leadership. After the defeat of the Void, Galvatron reinvents himself as a Cybertronian nationalist and militarist, representing ancient Cybertronian ideals, advocating for strength and expansion. So yeah, basically fills the void of Decepticon leadership after Megatron switches sides and becomes an Autobot. As the leader of a sizable faction of Decepticons, Galvatron emulates his former master Nova Prime's goals of restoring what he sees as Cybertron's rightful place as a galactic empire, and gets killed for it. Seeing Galvatron as selfishness incarnate, whose mere existence is a continued danger to Earth, to peace, and all Cybertronians, IDW Prime does his best impression of live-action movie Prime and blasts a defeated Galvatron point blank and then proceeds to rip off his head, finally ending him. And speaking of the live-action movies, a Galvatron does manage to show up in the fourth installment, The Age of Extinction. In the movie, a tech corporation called Kinetic Solutions Incorporated, or KSI for short, attempts to create their very own robots in disguise using an alien metal extracted from dead Transformers called Transformium. Yeah. Anyway, despite their best intentions to create their own savage killing machine, Optimus Prime, their Transformer mysteriously keeps overriding its programming and starts looking like another more silvery loser from the previous movies. I wonder why. I mean, I'm just guessing here, but could it be because they used Megatron's decapitated head as the base of their project? Apparently, despite getting an axe embedded into his skull and head and spine ripped off from his body in the last movie, this Megatron is only mostly dead, and what remains of his consciousness is slowly downloaded into and corrupts KSI's Transformer. And thus, Galvatron is born. I mean, you'd think if KSI really wanted to create a new Optimus, they would at least give him a more Prime-sounding name and not something that literally rhymed with Megatron. Well, at least they got the truck alt mode part right. And speaking of getting things right, I do hope I can successfully convince those of you who haven't yet to help my channel out by giving it a sub. I know, they say subs don't really matter in today's YouTube landscape. But yeah, seeing my sub count grow still does help boost content creator morale, which I think is just as important in helping me tell more stories and making my channel grow. So if you're enjoying this video, or at least even getting mildly entertained by it, your likes, comments, shares, and most importantly, subs will be immensely appreciated. So thank you. Anyway, despite his shocking reveal that no one saw coming, Galvatron doesn't really do anything in the movie. I mean, yes, he fights Prime and he has his one memorable line, once again voiced by Frank Welker, wherein he answers Prime's accusation of having no soul with,
"That is why I have no fear."
like he literally has a hole in his chest. Oh, and he has really crazy eyes and a visually cool but ultimately cop-out way of transforming, where he literally just breaks apart into a floating metal cloud and reforms into his alt mode. Hardly what I would define as a transformer, so yeah, let's just call this guy a reformer. Ultimately, nothing memorable. In the third act, Galvatron manages to survive getting his ass whooped by the Dinobots and lives to return in the next movie as Megatron. And that was all Mr. Bay wrote about his Galvatron. But that's not all I have written for Galvatron for my story, as we still have to go over the different Galvatron toys that have been released through the years, starting with the OG one in 1986. Like most of the new toys introduced that year, Galvatron's toy wasn't based on an older pre-existing Japanese Diaclone toy, but instead concept art by Filipino artist Floro Derry, done for the movie. Apparently, it was a really early concept design, as the toy sported a color deco that was obviously different from what we ended up seeing in the movie. However, that toy's more predominantly light gray look would be used in the early Marvel UK and US comics. But anyway, while he definitely had a strikingly unique, less earthy look to him, it was still the 80s, so in the end the toy was still a brick. At least his alt mode, that of a huge but mobile futuristic space cannon, which was more formidable than a handheld weapon, was more fitting for a Decepticon leader, or to be more precise, a Decepticon city commander. Like I mentioned in the start, Hasbro didn't outright market Galvatron as the new Decepticon leader, as I guess they wanted to keep that whole upgraded Megatron a surprise for the movie. Anyway, after all that, I actually never got this toy or handled him myself. I would have to wait over 2 decades later to finally get my hands on my very first Galvatron toy, and it would be quite the controversial one. Released in 2008, Universe Galvatron in my opinion looked really cool and menacing in both robot and tank mode, but ultimately was a majorly flawed toy. First off, he was small, like deluxe class small, and given his size, he felt really overly engineered. He also seemed to have extra articulated bits that seemed to hint at a third mode. In any case, it was later revealed that this Galvatron was indeed originally designed as a larger sized figure with a third walking tank mode, but all this was scrapped last minute to cut production costs. As a result, a lot of the tolerances were negatively affected by this abrupt change. In my fictional headcanon though, I'd like to think that this Galvatron time traveled from the present day, where current Transformer toy classes aren't necessarily defined solely by size, but more on accessories and parts count, back to 2008. So yeah, this deluxe Galvatron would most likely pass as a Voyager toy today. The bad tolerances can be explained as caused by the rigors of time travel. But seriously though, if this toy had been released just a few years later when oversized and improved knockoffs were a thing, this Galvatron design might have been more popular. In 2014, a third-party company, Unique Toys, tried to give us a more appropriately sized Galvatron in their Mania King. Now, I was extremely tempted to get this guy as he looked like a significant upgrade from the Universe version. But one major design flaw kept me from pulling the proverbial trigger: his gorilla arms. Seriously, this design choice was and continues to be a major peeve of mine. In hindsight though, my passing turned out to be a good thing, as a more reasonably priced official alternative was just around the corner. A couple years later, Hasbro finally gave us a properly sized Galvatron that was a headmaster. Yup, Titan's Return Galvatron came packed in with a new little buddy, Nucleon, that transformed into his head. Now, if you could get past the whole headmaster thingy, which admittedly looked a bit wonky in execution, this Galvatron was a pretty decent plastic representation of the guy who actually had a passable third space fighter mode. Also, the Japanese version sported a slightly lighter paint deco and retooled headmaster that was now Megatron. Eventually though, we would finally get a back-to-basics, non-gimmicky leader-class Galvatron in 2021's Kingdom line, with misassembled shoulders. Apparently, the first run of this toy came with the shoulder joints assembled the wrong way, which made this Galvatron look rather long-armed and simian in appearance. The fix though, while rather involved and a bit scary, wasn't too difficult, provided you had the right tools. So for a time, I would think sales for plastic auto vehicle dismantling device pry tools for cars must have spiked up quite a bit. Seriously though, given how relatively cheap these tools were, they have been extremely handy transforming tools for me, given that spudgers really aren't a thing in my country. But back to Galvatron, while I do believe that Hasbro really should get their shit together and not sell us toys that we have to fix on our own out of the box, doing work on my Galvatron actually gave me a better appreciation for the toy. It's pretty much the definitive Galvatron for my Chug collection. For now. But as you well know, for most hardcore Transformers collectors, Chug is only half the story. On the Masterpiece front, we did get two pretty great options for Galvatron in DX9's Tyrant and Fans Toys Sovereign, both released around 2016-17. And while I'm sure DX9's Tyrant has its fans, by default, I went with Fans Toys Sovereign, who is, in my opinion, close to pure Galvatron perfection, had it not been for his rather visible arms in cannon mode. Oh, and unfortunately, mine got a really visible paint chip on his left shoulder. FML. Oh well, easily remedied on the display. Also worth mentioning was a lesser-known third-party company called Open and Play that took the Titan's Return Galvatron, upsized and improved it into another masterpiece-ish option called Big Cannon. And while this guy is decent and the appropriate size for a masterpiece transformer, it is definitely on a much lower level tier than both Tyrant and Sovereign. Looking to the future though, we have perennial Fans Toys competitor X-Transbots, who has also announced their upcoming Galvatron called Abaddon, which also looks pretty good. But in true Fans Toys fashion, not long after, they announced their improved Sovereign 2.0 with non-visible arms and cannon mode. As of this writing though, both have yet to see the light of day. And finally, not to be outdone, the original third-party Galvatron maker, Unique Toys, released their masterpiece Galvatron in 2021 called Nero. Wait, okay, so this is their take on a live-action Age of Extinction Galvatron. And whether you like this version or not, I don't think anyone can deny that this guy is an engineering and design marvel. I mean, given that previous mainline live-action Galvatron toys were basically glorified shell formers, the fact that Unique Toys took this soulless, convoluted mess of a robot and managed to transform it into a streamlined and sleek truck cab is nothing short of miraculous.